Hi, everyone. I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And I'm so thrilled today to be talking all about the HBO Max series, Valley of Tears. And we're so fortunate to be joined by the wonderful creative team who spearheaded, created, wrote, and directed, and put this whole series together. We have the wonderful Ron Leshem, Amit Cohen, and Yaron Silberman. And I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about the perspective and the lens that you've taken with the show, because one of the things that really struck me is the way that the central focus is very much on characters and their personal experiences within, what's happening around them. And I was interested in kind of whether that was something that was very, very important from the get-go, that it was very much about the emotional experience and what these soldiers were going through at the time for all of you.
And at the same time, by the way, so we're telling 4 intense days. So it's really hectic, it's intense, it's supposed to make you feel the real war. And at the same, and we grew up on a lot of really powerful American war films. So one thing we wanted to make sure is that we are not imitating any conflict. We're choosing conflicts and dilemmas of war that you haven't seen in any other place. And in Israel, there are a few nuances and wars that you won't find anywhere else. So from one perspective, from the cinematic point of view, we wanted to make something that will have a unique voice of a war. At the same time, it's a character-driven story, and it's a kind of a social national reckoning for Israel that has never told this war. It's a war that changed the Middle East. It's a war that changed us. It changed Israel and the Israeli society. So it was kind of a reckoning, and we've never told it on screen. And in a sense, you can, when people ask us, okay, why did it take 10 years? And the first answer we say is, well, technically it's the largest production ever made in Israel. We usually, when we produce a TV show, we have the budget of the refreshment on an American set. We only have like 150K per episode. It's nothing. And here it was 10 times. I mean, we had to create the largest show ever made in Israel, but that's not the real thing. The real reason it took 10 years is like, these are stories that the Israeli society is repressing, never talks about. We never talk about it at home. These are such sensitive stories, and we had this burden on our shoulders getting into the story.
Mm-hmm. And I know that, kind of to that sensitivity and care in the way that you've told the story so thoughtfully, that part of that was, reading soldier testimonials from the time, from people who were serving, who experienced this, but also talking to people who are still around, who lived through it. And, I was interested in just kind of how you looked at all of these massive stories and testimonials from people who had that experience and started narrowing down what were the things that you were going to bring into the characters that you were creating, because it also wasn't something where you based a singular character on one person that you spoke to. It's really an amalgamation in the way that you brought these characters to life.
Yeah. So I can talk about the process of leading towards the filming, where we tried to meet as many soldiers who fought that war that are related to our story, of course. That included many soldiers that were in the Hermon post in the north that opens the story. So we met those who were eventually took captive. The Syrian took captive. So we had this whole experience from being there, like Avinoam, but also people like Yoav that fought, and also in the tank. On the tank side, we met the people who actually were in those battles, and we got these stories, and these stories are just not about necessarily what they did step by step, which we also want to know, and the script is well versed in that world, but emotionally, what's happening moment by moment, what do they feel, what are the in terms of the fear, how do you operate under extreme tension, anxiety, where you have to be at your best. Questions that are very, I would call them humane. It's about the individual. And we really try to get as much, both for inspiration and also in terms of the reality of the moment. And then to get the actors to be able to feel that, be inspired by that, and act within these, that framework, which again is very emotional framework. We were looking for that. because at the end of the day, we know it's people fighting people. It's not a tank, shooting another tank. This is not, war between machines. These are people that operates it. You see what's happening in a tank. There's dynamic, real social dynamic, and each individual has their own way of dealing with the shell shock of being under war, that you can die any second, your friend can die any second. I think that's where we were aiming for in terms of the experience. And I think also in terms of feedback, I'm getting feedback. I'm not talking about Israel because that's overwhelming in terms of how personal it becomes. But I'm getting feedback from the US with my friends that they all talk about this. They feel like as if they're in the tank with, that unit. And I think that's, something that we're very proud of, Ron, Amit, and myself, that we managed to get that kind of, feeling. You're inside the battle. Now let's watch what happens in a way.
In Israel, the impact that we're receiving is unbelievable. It's treated much more than a series. It's an event, and part of it is because it affected Israel entirely, the society itself. Israel is such a small place that this war practically affected anyone. So when we started choosing the stories were all around us. In each one of us. My wife's grandfather met his son, who was a tank driver, so he met him in the battlefront, in the front. My father served in an intelligence intelligence unit, just like Avinoam. And when he saw the first episode, he had tears in his eyes because it reminded him of the same scene. It's something that happened to him. He was at the day of the war. He was receiving a guest coming from Tel Aviv, another intelligence officer, and he gave him the tour. He showed him all the signs, all the indications. Then they went into the bunker, and my father told him, a war is about to happen. It can happen anytime, any moment. And this guy told him, I see what you're showing me. So we don't think war will happen. The Egyptians will not start a war. And at the exact same moment, Egyptian jet fighters attacked, and they were in the bunker. So it feels so personal and so emotional, and it affected everyone. It was like you're saying, the challenge wasn't to find the stories; it was to narrowing down and make it and picking the emotional journeys of the characters. So this is what we did. I mean, once we completed the research, once we felt comfortable with the real events, the mission was to pick the fictional characters and and build a drama series.
And I know that in terms of writing the scripts as well, that part of the process was also kind of researching and looking very specifically at what the dialogue between the soldiers within the army would be authentically, and was interested in kind of like how that informed a lot of the dialogue that you all wrote for the scripts.
So for us, the interesting thing for me is that the toughest thing is the moment where we need to choose who we are telling and who we are skipping. And so there were so many incredible stories over there. We wanted to bring our own personal stories, like Amit's father, who was shouting the warning signs. I wanted to bring my father, who was an accountant, a young accountant, never trained into battlefield and was sent to be a gunner in our artillery. But at the same time, each of us wanted to kind of be his alter ego. Usually when we ride, and each of us chooses one or few characters that he want to be, or he want to be under the skin of, or see the world through his eyes, or he's attracted to. And choosing these voices is the most charming part of the work. And then when we write, we don't choose cast an actress or an actor who would be our ideal casting for that, but we choose still photographies of faces we don't know. Just we are diving into hundreds, sometimes thousands of still photographies that are inspiring. Sometimes it's faces and sometimes it's moment, and we choose the face, and just the mystery of the idea of what's behind this face, or if I'm attracted to this face, I want to be this friend of him, and it's impossible because either he died or he's 50 years older or whatever. But these faces are looking at us from the walls, and they're always there, and they're with us for the years of the writing. So and the next phase would be just we are writing words and slang and sentences we are hearing, and we're of course listening to music of the time and everything, just to be able to start talking through the voices of these unique individuals. And for us, we were fearful of the fact that there were millions of Israelis that were affected by the war and are going to be obsessed with checking every single details. Right now, like when you log into the Facebook pages and you see tons of thousands of people writing every day, is it true that this candy was already existed? And they're obsessed. But the one thing that when we felt, when we started getting the numbers and realized that the show broke all rating records for drama in Israel, we were happy, of course, but that wasn't the important moment for us. The important moment for us was the idea of realistically, those soldiers and their grandkids and their kids who are watching feel their authenticity. And that was we were basically fearful of that, and thanks God it went well.
Yeah, and kind of just see that.
I think it's super important for Israeli audience, and we try to stay authentic. And at some point, someone asked me if the conversation in the tanks were they real fictional, or did we take like real conversations from the war and embedded it in it? But it's more than Israel now. I went on Twitter this morning and I saw people from Turkey and from Sweden talking about the tanks, and they said how were they able to get these Centurion tanks that they were decommissioned? Yaron, how many, like 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, the tanks?
Yeah.
People all around the world are feeling the realism and the authenticity, which is, I think, is amazing. Sorry.
Yeah. No, but with the tanks as well, that was, I believe that was like an incredible journey to get authentic tanks, and you took a lot of tanks that were actually from that specific time that had been used in the war, and had them retrofitted out with new engines so that they were actually usable, and also looked at shipping some over from the States. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, even just specifically the tanks, because they're such an important detail that really feeds into the way that you feature them in the episodes.
Yeah. So the tank, the tank that Israel, the IDF used during that period in the north are called Centurion, which is a British tank that later got an American engine in for various reasons. They needed diesel to change from benzene, but anyway, so we had to find these tanks, and it was very difficult. And eventually, we knew like there are people. I worked with one of our consultants, military consultant, knew every tank where it is in Israel, and we went one after the other, and he kept on saying, this one we won't be able to get working at all. And they open each tank, like an old tank, open the engine, test it, just like you do in cars, until eventually you find one of them, and that was the first sort of tank that we managed to get back to working, including, as I said, the army put a new engine in it. And we had, we needed more tanks. So we used tanks that were in these battles that are spread all over the north of Israel, Ramat Golan, that were hit during the war. So these are like authentic tanks from the period. And then the art department sort of recreate them again. When you see a tank being blown up, it's a tank that was already blown up in the past, and we just set it for that moment. So we're doing this kind of magic, and of course we needed Syrian tanks as well. That when you have the battles, you see Syrian tanks. So these are tanks that the IDF managed to sort of get during the war to capture. And we managed to get them going as well. So it was a cumbersome experience, but it was amazing to see them, drive on location in the places where we filmed, where these battles took place, actual battles. You were there and they were there. And, we're talking about here, like a couple of, meters by, there was a Syrian commando shooting at the tanks, and another Israeli commando arrived and they had a battle. It's all happening in front of your eyes. And in a way, you have the ghosts of war surrounding you when you actually film that. The actors feel it, the team, the crew. We're all inside that war spiritually, which is the only way for us to portray the war in a realistic way.
And by the way, I mean, in the US, it's easy to find people selling these tanks on Craigslist. And for years, for a few years, we were trying to buy tanks in the US, also in East Europe. People in East Europe would sell you easily a tank, but here people have it on their backyards. But the Israeli law forbids you from importing tanks into Israel, even if it's for shooting, and it was impossible to find any flexibility with the government on that. So we had a lot of these type of problems. At the same time, Yaron had to shoot on the border of Syria, where tragedy is happening on the other side. There's still a civil war over there. For a while, for 3 weeks, they had to shut off the filming because of missiles and rockets being fired at the locations of the shooting. And all of this is happening when you're filming, and so many, sometimes tens of or hundreds of soldiers know that you're filming their war, so they're curious to take a look or talk to the actors or see the scene. Right? It was a very unique experience, and it comes. Each of us, the Israeli industry, TV and films, is so tiny. So each of us works kind of globally. Yaron had a film here in Hollywood and it worldwide, and we created shows even in Korea and in France. We're constantly traveling, but for such a long time, for these 10 years, we knew that we must go back and do this show. This is the one, our passion project, that we had to go back to Israel and create. And it was impossible, so it's a really important moment for us right now in our career.
I was also interested and wanted to ask a little bit about, the unique challenges when you were writing characters and kind of determining their moral compass or how they were going to respond to certain situations. Because as you mentioned before, the whole series takes place over just a matter of days. So it's a very short space of time. At the same time, they're in very extreme circumstances. So it's not something that we typically experience every day to know, oh, that's how you respond. And part of what's so fascinating about the series is watching these characters not even know how they're going to respond to what's happening to them, and constantly having to pivot new and really extreme circumstances. So it's interesting, overall, and kind of like how that made really unique challenges as you were crafting and writing these characters and thinking about what their response would be in each moment.
But each of these moments, all of them are true and real. So we did change names, and we sometimes combine two souls into one character. But eventually, all of this, you're watching it and you're thinking, "Whoa, this is dramatically, this is insane." Such a dilemma that a kid is facing, and you haven't seen it in any previous war films, and you think, "Well, it's an imagination." But no, we were trying to be 100% accurate in each of the situations. And the crazy thing is that after every episode, you would, the moment the episode ends, you would see hundreds of people writing on Facebook, "No way it happened." And then hundreds of people writing, "Yeah, this is my story. It happened to me. It happened to my father." And we're surprised because we didn't know about his father. We used inspiration from another story. But this was so sacred and holy for us to make sure that the conflicts between them and the dilemmas are real. So it is a challenge, but it was a bit easier when we decided just to be loyal to the emotional reality and to the reality.
It's a cooking. The 4 days, on one hand, it is a cooking pressure, but it differentiates us from other war series like Band of Brothers or Generation Kill that span over months and years. Here we have 4 days, 4 intense days. And dramatically, it's an opportunity to take the characters and throw them into this cooking pressure and see what will happen, not only on the war. The war is there, but we wanted to show how a friendship is created between Avinoam and Yoav. We wanted to take 3 best friends and throw them into this situation and see what will happen to their friendship. We wanted to show a relationship between a father and a son. These are universal conflicts. This is not something that anyone can relate to when you look at the war, I mean, if you ignore the war and you look only on the emotional and conflict, it's still something that you can relate to regardless to the war. The fact that we have this craziness around them, hell going around them, dramatically only intensifies this conflict. So I think it complemented each other. It wasn't like opposing. It helped the characters to evolve fast.
I also wanted to ask a little bit about the way in which you all worked with the cast once they were on board in kind of making sure that their portrayals were going to bring that same level of authenticity and detail that you had taken with the creation of the show and with these characters. And, you know, I know that you were mentioning military consultants and was interested if they were also, you know, able to work with them, you know, especially because when you look at the conflict scenes, they're so, you know, stunningly executed in terms of like the detail and the way that it really just feels like you're right in the center of it with these characters.
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways to approach it. I mean, first it starts with the casting. So you want to cast an Avinoam who will be able to portray Avinoam very sort of naturally, right? That's what you want because it's a tough, you know, character in terms of if you're not Avinoam, it's very tough. But if the actor is Avinoam, then this is a good starting point. So that's an example where Shachar Tabu, who plays Avinoam, enters the audition room, and on the spot you say hi. He just says, "Hi, I'm Shachar." The way he says that, you know, I look at the casting director and we're like, "This is Avinoam." You already know that you found Avinoam on the first word, and then it's just about, you know, with the audition to see that we got the right person, that he can handle the whole arc that he's going to go through, which is a crazy arc, very challenging to any actor. He was in the army, serving the army when he came to audition. Imagine, it's like a 19-year-old, 20-year-old that shows up. And then once you do that, there's a whole training process. So a couple of things. First, we, you know, created sort of meetings between the warriors, I mean, those veterans that were there, the soldiers, and the specific actor, and all this through this conversation. Again, it enhances the, you know, the behavior, the way they talk, also the language. You know, just adding more and more of that particular lingo, 1973 army, specific to the tanks. So that's something we got from the people we met. Also, we had this, as we said, the military advisor who, you know, work more and more into all the battles, all what would people say, and it's so specific. You know, one can work on that forever until you get it right. And although the audience doesn't exactly know the term sometimes, it doesn't matter as long as the actor plays it with such confidence and he speaks these words and they are true for him. Then we feel the truthness of these statements, which, you know, sort of are more important, are primary to that experience. So that and this, and so these meetings, and of course a lot of reading, you know, around that. The script is fantastic, but the actor needs to get, you know, from everywhere they can. So they watched all the documentaries on the period, and from, you know, from that, and then emotionally also, once you get into, you know, the army uniform and you get into a tank, and suddenly you need to learn how to carry these, you know, the how you call them, the bombs, the shells, to carry them and to be able to do this whole operation. I find that when they practice, that they actually get into the character. There's something about it, especially, you know, in acting, when you're doing some kind of a emotion, you have an activity, an action that is very demanding, then the characteristic flow naturally and the whole acting flows naturally because you are really engaged in something else. You're not aware of the character, you are the character. So, you know, these and so many other, you know, techniques. And also I want to say that in general, the concept was to create a unit with these actors. The more they'll feel the responsibility to each other, that they are dependent, the dependency, because they are at war and they need to survive and they are under attack. The more, you know, behind the camera, so to speak, they become friends. We see that relationship in front of the camera. And so, you know, we did all that. and
And
more.
you've seen them crying on set so often. It never happens to us, even in the more
Oh, yeah.
emotionally engaging projects. And I think for us as writers, there's sometimes when as a writer, sometimes you know their project that you are being obsessed with every single word and detail for a character. You don't want the the cast to bring anything from themselves into it because it create kind of a mess. And here in this unit, and it happened because two things. One, when you have a partner, a director who comes from cinema and is very cinematic, and a cast of the best, the A-list cast of Israel, who each of them, we wanted them to feel so involved. So we were really open with saying, listen, we want something to happen between the director and the cast when they live together up on this mountain, and we wanted each of them to bring something into the character, and we are going to be totally flexible and open to falling in love with the changes. It's not often that it happens to you in a project, and we want to be surprised, and we want to find new paths for them emotionally. And it created something, and you know how hard it is for writers and for any filmmaker, you because this is the most important project for you, and yet you're doing a lot of compromises, but at the same time it creates something that is really unique and is a creation of a group. And in many ways, so when we started it years ago, when we had the mission of choosing what stories we're about to tell, we brought some of the most important authors in Israel to the room. Some of them don't have experience with screenwriting, others do have, but we said, let's choose it with them and let's do this process with them. And sometimes each of them had just one idea of a moment that survived this years. A moment where we just talked yesterday about how there is a moment when the father who goes to the war to look for his son, when he's tries to talk to his son who doesn't answer him, he is on the radio, he's telling him a story he used to tell him as a kid. And this is a moment that one of the authors suggested years ago, and it changed so much throughout the years, but there's something that happened there that is unlike anything else, because the entire war is just listening to a kid's story at the most horrific moment of this war. So a lot of these moments came from this collaboration that was very unique as a project.
And in terms of the audience, because you mentioned how many years you were working on this project and developing it for, did you think about this solely and very specifically as kind of like that catharsis that you were talking about for Israeli audiences, or were you thinking about an international lens and people coming into this who had very little, and maybe no knowledge prior to watching the series about, what had happened and how this occurred? Because there's been more of an influx of Israeli television into Europe and into America in recent years. But at the point when you started developing this, that really wasn't the case at that point.
So each of us will have, I guess, a different question, a different answer for this one. I think each of us comes with different motivations, maybe sometimes. I don't know. We never talked about it. It wasn't an issue there. But I would just say, before I let them answer, I would just say there is a thing with the Israeli television is that on the one hand, the Israeli audience is the most neurotic audience in the world. They're more neurotic than Americans and anywhere else. They get bored really easily. So you're always constantly creating something really edgy. And at the same time, it's always about, it needs to be a kind of a mainstream, because for a drama to work in Israel, we are aspiring to get to 30% ratings. You would never find that anywhere in the world. So the idea of edgy and mainstream together, this edgy mainstream creates a very unique drama in Israel. And we always have the urge to fly out with it. I mean, it's not like, usually when you're a Swedish writer, you don't have that urge of going out and telling stories to others. And when you're an American writer, yeah, you write in Hollywood and sell to American stories to 160 nations worldwide. Israel had this kind of transformation of going out with its drama, and we were involved in many of these projects, sometimes as TV executives that we were, and sometimes as producers, sometimes as writers. But that project is unlike anything else. It was meant to be a national reckoning, as I said. It was meant to be something that is totally Israeli. I personally, I'm curious to hear what the guys think, but I personally never thought of it as a story that will travel outside. And now, not only do we hear this feedback from the US, from HBO Max, but just this weekend when it was launched in Spain and Portugal, in East Europe, in all around Asia and Scandinavia, and we're getting response of people who feel that these characters are relatable. This is almost surprising for me, but I always tend to think, yeah, as much as you, the more provincial you are, the more universal you are because of the nuances of the story. But again, I'm curious to hear what they think.
I agree. Just like you said, when we started working on it, it wasn't even an option. I mean, no one could imagine an Israeli show, like a Hebrew-speaking show, being sold and broadcasted to international audience. So it was before all the streamers, before all the VODs. But more than that, for me, I think the show is, yes, it's about the war. It's about the war with Syria, but it's not about the Arab. I mean, for me, again, personally, it's not about the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's an inner look on Israeli society. We wanted to deal with Israeli society. And this is the reason that we're so focused on aspects of the Israeli society. And we look at things that happened in 73 with retrospective of 2020. We talk about 73, but we look at our times, how Israel is now, and how process that started 40 or 50 years ago is relevant for our days. That said, I mean, HBO Max, we were so grateful they bought it. And just like Ron said, I mean, from our experience, and we had other shows that were sold, if you try to engineer something for an international audience, if you try to, I don't know, to flatter international audience, I think you'll fail. And you need to create the best story you can, regardless to the language, regardless to your audience. Just make it authentic. When I watch international shows, it could be My Brilliant Friend or Babylon Berlin. I don't want an international aspect to it. I want to see Naples. I want to see Napoli in the 50s. I want to see Germany post World War I. I don't want it to be another international show. I want it to feel unique, and I want an opportunity to peep into a specific culture. And I think this is what I hope and think that this is what we're giving here with our show.
Yeah, because everything was already said and correctly, I would just say that for me, when I approach the project, I always look at what's called the subject matter. That's what I care about. I'm not looking at anything that has to do with distribution, selling, nothing of that sort. I'm just looking at the story, the characters, and I want to make sure that the people that we're portraying will feel that this is really their story. That's what I care about. If it's a string quartet in Manhattan or swimmers in their 80s in Vienna, it's for me, it's always, the compass is always one. With the people that live that we are now portraying, telling their story, would they feel authentic or not? This is my compass and leading always. And when you go after that, it's some kind of a feeling. It's a confidence in a way that if you will portray it correctly, so they feel that it's not foreign to them, the audience everywhere will be able to relate to it and feel these emotions and the truthfulness of that moment. So I believe it's all aligned, and one has to go that way. That's the approach that we took.
Yeah. And for each of you, is there kind of an aspect in the way that you told the story or the work that you did on this series that you're proudest of, kind of looking back at the whole experience at this point?
Wow. I can say for me, it's very hard to say because I'm overwhelmed emotionally, to be honest. In Israel, they screened the 6th episode yesterday. We all gathered together like a big family to watch it. Really overwhelming experience for us because we are now living, the creation of it and being affected by it as if we are outside of making it. Because when you make, you're there with the screws and balls, and there's so much technical work. It's all emotional, but it's also so many details. It's very hard to say. I personally very proud of the reaction that we get to, especially, first in Israel, there's incredible internationally now, but in Israel, it's overwhelming what it does. I'll give you one story. It's a tough one, but I just want to share as an example. Ron and I spoke about it earlier. It's, I got today a text from a friend who told me that her friend committed suicide several years ago because he was in Yom Kippur War, and the devastating experience wouldn't let him sleep at night. So he went into spiral of, drinking during the night. And we're talking about decades later, it's 47 years later, and he couldn't handle it anymore. And she wrote to me that if he would have seen the show, she thinks he would not have committed suicide. That's the level of what in Israel, the emotional response to the show is a healing process. Is something that, because we're working with a sort of an association in Israel that helps shell shock post-traumatic soldiers. That's what they do. They help them. So if you're under stress, you call them and they will give you psychological help, therapy for free, and they take care of it. So they are involved, and we're seeing, how this relationship with them is really a healing process for the whole country. I'm so proud of that, and I overwhelmed from that.
By the way, the healing is also from that, besides that aspect, which is really important for us, and and the network is so sensitive to that. So they're airing after every episode. They have a studio show talking with real characters and people who suffer from trauma. Then they have a radio show. They have digital clips, whatever. It's a huge thing around it. But another aspect of the healing is the fact that after years where how the Israeli society, a bit like here, is tend to be very full of rage and even violence on social media about everything, and we are kind of torn apart. There are deep gashes widening within our society, and people are losing faith in democracy, and people have so much rage towards one another. In all those huge groups of hundreds of thousands of people talking about the show, there's something not only civilized but full of compassion, because we feel we're reuniting. And for us, I think when we started writing this, there was one thing we were wishing, and I hope we will achieve, was the fact that we always felt that after this moment, that was the biggest trauma ever for Israel, it almost ceased to exist because of its sin, because of being blind to warning signs. We all promised ourselves to be better people and to be a better nation and to be a better country after this war. And what we tried to do is tell a story that is so timely, and ask ourselves, are we fulfilling this, the thing we promised to the people we lost and to our families? And we wanted people to take a lot from that story to our timely agendas and ideas and themes, and even just the idea of warning signs, the idea that Amit's father was shouting, and so many others, Avinoam, nerdy guys who were trying to shout, we missed the warning sound. It has to do now with global warming and climate change. It has to do with the collapse of democracies and people losing faith in it. It has to do with so many things that we believe that we should be awakening to be sensitive to. So that's, if I'm proud of anything more than just the cinematic achievement, is hopefully is this.
And I want to add, in addition to the things that Ron and Yaron said, which I totally agree, on a personal level, we live in a world where sometimes it's so much easier to have a commercial success with other shows, with reality shows or game shows or things that are more light and more flattering. And the fact that we were able to achieve such an impact, touch so many people with drama, with a fictional story, this is what we do. This is we make stuff. We create stories. We tell lies in a way, but we do it because we want to affect people. We want to touch their souls, and to see the responses that we get is overwhelming, like Yaron said, and it's touching and encouraging. And I don't know if I'll use the word proud, but I'm really grateful for it. It's really overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a really stunningly incredible piece of storytelling, and it's so remarkable just to hear, the impact that it's had in the way that it's connecting with audiences. And you know, it is the example of how we always say that storytelling has the power to change lives, and it's incredible to hear these stories. And thank you so much for talking with us this afternoon so much about the show and the experience of making it.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.